She thought she was answering an ad for housekeeping work. She had no idea she was walking into a family that was quietly falling apart. 5 children, a man drowning in grief, and a ranch that smelled like something had died inside its walls long before anyone noticed. The moment Vivian Mercer stepped through that door, the man who had hired her didn't even look up from his paperwork, didn't offer a hand, didn't say a word about the 5 pairs of eyes watching her from the staircase like she was either a miracle or another person about to walk back out. He had lied in the advertisement. Not with false words, but with missing ones. And that kind of lie? That's the one that cuts the deepest. If that had been you standing in that doorway, would you have stayed? Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if they remind you what real strength looks like, please take a second to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The advertisement had been folded so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases, like something that had been carried around in a pocket for too long before someone finally decided to act on it. Housekeeper wanted. Remote ranch, fair wages, steady work, inquire at Iron Creek, Harlan County, Texas. That was all it said. 8 words that Vivian Mercer had read so many times in the 3 days before she packed her single trunk that she could have recited them in her sleep. Fair wages. Steady work. That was enough. After everything that had happened in Ohio, she wasn't asking the world for much more than that. She was 27 years old, and she had already learned the hard way that the world doesn't hand you a clean start. You have to show up and scrub it yourself. The stage from Caldwell dropped her off at a crossroads with nothing but a wooden post and a name burned into it. Iron Creek, 4 miles. The driver had given her a look when she'd asked him to stop there. The kind of look that said, "You sure about this, lady?" But he hadn't said it out loud because there was something in Vivian's expression that discouraged that kind of question. She'd thanked him, pulled her trunk down herself before he could offer to help, and started walking. 4 miles of Texas dust and flat sky. She walked it the way she walked most things, straight ahead, eyes forward, jaw set just enough to let the doubt know it wasn't welcome. She'd had a job before the one in Ohio, and before that, another one. She was good at work. She was good at order. She knew how to turn a kitchen from chaos into something functional in under an hour, knew how to stretch a larder through a hard week, knew how to get stains out of things other women had given up on. These were not small skills. She had learned them the way most women of her generation learned most useful things, not from a book, but from necessity. What she had not been good at historically was people who lied to her face. The first thing she noticed about Iron Creek Ranch was the fence. One whole section of it had pulled away from its posts and nobody had fixed it. It leaned at an angle that suggested it had been leaning like that for a long time. Not the fresh collapse of something that had just given way, but the patient, gradual surrender of something that had been ignored until ignoring it became the new normal. The second thing she noticed was the garden, or what had been a garden once. The dead stalks of things that had tried to grow and failed stood in rows like a small regiment of giving up. Weeds had moved in around them with the confidence of an occupying force. The third thing she noticed was the smell. She was still 20 yards from the front door when it reached her. Wood smoke, yes, but underneath it something sour and stale. Not rot exactly, more like the smell of a house where the windows hadn't been opened in months. The smell of a home that had stopped breathing. She knocked, no answer for a long moment. Then footsteps. Not the heavy stride of a man, but the quick, light scatter of children. And she heard a voice hissing from the other side of the door. He said, "Don't open it." Another voice, smaller. "But what if she leaves?" Vivian stood on the porch and waited. She was good at waiting. The door opened. The man who opened it was not what she had pictured from the advertisement, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had pictured. He was tall. That was the first thing. Broad through the shoulders in the way of men who do real physical work, not the kind of broad that comes from intention. His hair needed cutting, his jaw needed a razor. He was wearing a work shirt that had a tear near the left shoulder that someone had attempted to mend with thread that didn't quite match. And the attempt had been abandoned halfway through, so the tear was half closed and half open, which struck Vivian later as being about the most accurate description of Silas Granger she would ever find. He looked at her the way people look at something they've been waiting on for a while but aren't sure they're ready for now that it's actually arrived. "Miss Mercer," he said. It wasn't a question. Mr. Granger. She looked past him, just for a second, just long enough to count. 1, 2, 3. They were on the stairs. A fourth one was visible through the kitchen doorway at the far end of the hall, just a shape, watching. And then from somewhere above, the sound of small feet crossing a floor, and she knew before she saw her that there was a fifth. 5 children. The advertisement had said nothing about children. "You have children," Vivian said. "I do." He said it the way a man says something he's decided not to be apologetic about. The advertisement didn't mention children. "No," he agreed. "It didn't." She looked at him steadily. He looked back. Neither of them looked away. "How many?" 5. The number sat between them like something he'd put down on a table and was waiting to see if she'd pick up. "How old?" "Wyatt's 15, Clara's 12, Thomas is 9, Ruth is 6. A pause. "Ellie's 4. Vivian turned and looked at the road she'd just walked up. 4 miles of Texas dust. The stage was long gone. Her trunk was sitting on the porch behind her, and she had exactly $4.30 in the pocket of her traveling dress. She turned back. "I'd like to see the kitchen," she said. Well, the kitchen was a catastrophe. Not the kind of catastrophe that happens all at once, not a disaster, but the slow, grinding catastrophe of a household where the person who had known how to run it was gone, and everyone left behind had been improvising for so long that the improvisation had become the system. Dishes stacked in a way that suggested someone had washed the top ones and left the bottom ones for later, again and again, until later became the answer to everything. A pot on the stove with something dried and crusted in the bottom that Vivian did not investigate too closely. Flour on the table and on the floor and on the window ledge in a way that suggested an attempt at baking had been made and abandoned at some critical moment. She stood in the middle of it and did not say a word. Silas Granger stood in the doorway and watched her look at his kitchen with the expression of a man braced for judgment. "Mrs. Granger passed," he said after a moment. Not an explanation, more like something he was getting out of the way. "When?" 14 months ago. She nodded. She didn't say "I'm sorry" because he hadn't said it looking for sympathy. She filed the number away. 14 months. And understood a great deal about the state of the kitchen from just that one piece of information. "I'll need access to the larder and the smokehouse," she said, "and I'll need to know what the children eat and what they won't." "They'll eat what's in front of them." "That hasn't been working," she said plainly. Not unkindly, just plainly. Something moved across his face. He was a man who was not accustomed to being contradicted by someone who'd been in his house for less than 10 minutes. But he didn't argue. He just nodded once and stepped back from the doorway to let her pass. She walked the house. She did it methodically, room by room, the way she always assessed a new situation. Not looking for what was wrong so she could catalog it and feel superior, but looking for what was wrong so she could understand the shape of the problem before she tried to solve it. 5 rooms upstairs, 2 down. The children's rooms were overcrowded with the kind of clutter that accumulates when nobody's enforcing order, but also nobody's cruel enough to throw anything away. Clara's room had a broken chair in the corner and a dress hanging on the wall that was too small by at least a year, kept, Vivian understood, for reasons that had nothing to do with practical use. She stopped in the doorway of that room for a moment longer than the others. Clara was 12 and watching her from the bed with an expression that had too much caution in it for a 12-year-old. Too much experience of being disappointed. The kind of expression children develop when adults have let them down enough times that they've decided to stop expecting anything and see what happens. "You're Clara," Vivian said. "Yes, ma'am." "You've been doing most of the cooking." Clara blinked. "How did you—" "Your hands," Vivian said simply, and she moved on. She found the problem with Wyatt 20 minutes later, and the problem with Wyatt was that he was 15 years old and had decided somewhere in the last 14 months that the most useful thing he could be was a wall. He was in the barn when she came looking for Silas to ask about the water supply, and she would have walked past him if he hadn't said something. "He's not going to keep you." She stopped, looked at him. He was sitting on a hay bale, arms crossed, not looking at her, looking at the middle distance the way teenagers look at things when they want you to know they're not impressed. "He never keeps them," Wyatt continued. "There were 2 before you. The first one left after a week. The second one lasted 4 days. What happened to them?" He shrugged. They didn't like it here. What didn't they like? All of it. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were not hostile exactly. Something harder than hostile. Something more tired. We're a lot, and he's not easy, and the work doesn't stop. Vivian studied him for a moment. He had his father's jaw, squared off and set. He was going to be a big man someday, but right now he was still caught in the awkward middle ground of it, broad-shouldered and not quite sure what to do with the width yet. I noticed, she said, about the work. So you're leaving. I didn't say that. But you're thinking about it. She considered lying. Yes, she said. I'm thinking about it. That surprised him. She could see it, a flicker of something in his expression that wasn't quite respect, but was in the neighborhood of it. He'd expected denial. People who were planning to disappoint you usually started by telling you they weren't. The fence along the north pasture needs resetting, she said. 3 posts, maybe 4. Your father know about it? Wyatt looked at her strangely. Yeah, he knows. Why hasn't it been fixed? Because there's always something else. She nodded. That's usually the way. She left him in the barn and went to find Silas. She found him in the small office off the main hallway, bent over a ledger with the expression of a man reading bad news he already knew was coming. He didn't look up when she came in. I have questions, she said. I imagine you do. The advertisement said housekeeping, nothing about children. The children need a housekeeper. That's not what housekeeping means, and you know it. He set down his pen, looked at her. What does it mean to you, Miss Mercer? It means I keep the house. I clean, I cook, I maintain order. It does not mean I raise your children. Nobody asked you to raise them. 5 children and a ranch this size after 14 months of, she paused, chose the word carefully, settling, means that whoever is in that kitchen is not just keeping a house. They are being asked to step into a role that nobody has occupied for over a year. He was quiet. You should have been honest in the advertisement, she said. If I'd been honest, he said, nobody would have come. She opened her mouth, closed it, because that was infuriating, and also she understood with a clarity that annoyed her, probably true. I'm giving you 1 week, she said finally. 1 week. To prove that this position is what you said it was, and not something else entirely. If at the end of 1 week the situation is different from what I understand it to be, I'll expect a fair wage for the time I've worked in transportation to the nearest town. He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, more like recalibration. Fair enough, he said. She turned to leave. Miss Mercer. She stopped. The children's mother, he started and then stopped. Started again. They've been through considerable difficulty. I can see that, she said. They don't need another person who leaves. She didn't answer right away. She stood in the doorway of his small office with the failing late afternoon light coming through the single window, and she thought about the road she'd walked up, and the fence that was leaning, and Clara's hands, and Wyatt's tired eyes, and somewhere upstairs a 4-year-old named Ellie, who she hadn't met yet. That you shouldn't have lied to the last 2 women who came here, she said, and you shouldn't have lied to me. She went upstairs before he could respond. Ellie was in the hallway. She was sitting on the floor just outside the door to what must have been her room, and she was holding something, a small piece of cloth, folded and refolded into an irregular square the way children carry things that matter more than they can explain. She had dark hair and her father's straight brows and eyes that were too serious and too watchful for a 4-year-old, and she was looking at Vivian with an expression that stopped Vivian completely. Not hope, exactly. Vivian had seen hope in children's faces, and it looked wider than this, more open. This was something that had learned to protect itself from hope, something that wanted very badly to hope, but had been taught by recent experience to hold back. It was the most heartbreaking 4 feet of human being Vivian had ever encountered. Hello, Vivian said, crouching down so she was at eye level. Ellie said nothing. I'm Vivian. Still nothing, but the eyes tracked her, careful and intent. What's that you've got? Vivian nodded at the cloth. Ellie looked down at it, then back up. Then, slowly, she unfolded it. It was a handkerchief, small and white and embroidered in one corner, with a single flower, stitches that were careful and precise and done by someone who had known what they were doing, the kind of needlework you don't rush. Vivian understood without being told who had made it. "That's beautiful," she said quietly. Ellie folded it back up again. Then she stood, very small and very deliberate, and she walked past Vivian down the hall toward the stairs. 3 steps down, she stopped and looked back, and her expression said something that she didn't have the words for yet. She wasn't asking Vivian to follow her. She was just looking. The way you look at something you're not sure you're allowed to want. Vivian stood at the top of the stairs for a long time after Ellie disappeared. She did not make the decision standing there. She told herself she didn't make it standing there. But she didn't go back downstairs to tell Silas Granger she was leaving either. Instead, she went into the kitchen and lit the stove and found the ingredients for something simple and hot and filling. And when the children appeared at the kitchen doorway one by one over the next half hour, cautious, silent, waiting to see what this woman would do, she handed them each a task and spoke to them in a tone that expected the task to be done. Not because she had decided to stay, but because there were 5 children in this house, and they were hungry, and it was nearly dark, and someone had to feed them. She figured she could make the bigger decision in the morning. She had a feeling, though, and she was rarely wrong about feelings, that the morning was going to look different than she expected. She just didn't know yet how much different. The morning did look different. Not better exactly, not worse, just different in the way that mornings look when you've slept in a strange house and woken up already knowing you've made a decision you haven't admitted to yourself yet. Vivian was up before the light. She had always been an early riser, not from virtue, but from habit. The body learns what it needs to learn to survive, and in her case, surviving had generally required being the first one awake and the last one to stop moving. She lay in the narrow bed in the small room off the kitchen that Silas had shown her the night before. A room that was technically adequate and practically depressing, with a single window, a washstand with a cracked basin, and a mattress that had seen better decades. And she stared at the ceiling and made herself think clearly. She was 27 years old. She had $4.30. The nearest town was 4 miles down a road she had already walked once and had no particular desire to walk again in the dark before the stage came through. She had no family left in Ohio, no position waiting for her anywhere else, and nothing pulling her forward except the same stubborn forward motion that had carried her this far. Those were the practical facts. The other facts were less easy to categorize. 5 children. The oldest one building a wall around himself brick by brick and calling it strength. The second one working herself to the edge of a 12-year-old's capacity and not complaining because complaining had stopped producing results. A 9-year-old she'd barely seen, Thomas, who had appeared at the kitchen table the night before, eaten everything on his plate without a word, and disappeared again so efficiently that she'd half wondered if she'd imagined him. Ruth, who was 6 and had talked enough for 3 people once she'd decided Vivian wasn't a threat, asking questions about Ohio and whether there were different kinds of trees there, and what Vivian's favorite color was, and whether she knew how to braid hair. This last question delivered with a pointed look at her own hair, which clearly had not been properly braided in some time. And Ellie, 4 years old and carrying a dead woman's handkerchief, like a piece of herself she wasn't ready to put down. Vivian got up. She got dressed in the dark because she'd learned to do that too. She went to the kitchen and she started a fire in the stove. She told herself she was only making breakfast. By the time the household woke up, there was coffee on, biscuits in the oven, and Vivian had spent 40 minutes assessing the larder with the systematic focus of someone who had done this before and knew that the most important thing you could understand about any household was whether it could feed itself. The answer at Iron Creek was barely, and not for much longer without intervention. Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:15, hat already on, clearly expecting to find the room the same way he'd left it the night before. He stopped. "You're still here," he said. "I said I'd give you a week." He looked at the biscuits, looked at the coffee, looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between relief and suspicion, which was probably fair. "I need to talk to you about the larder," she said. "Good morning to you too, Miss Mercer." "Good morning. The larder is short on staples and long on things that have been there since before your wife passed. I found flour with weevils and salt pork that needs to be used this week or thrown out. I'll need a list of what you can afford and when you're next going to town, so I can tell you what to get." He poured himself coffee, which she had made strong enough because she'd guessed he'd need it, and she'd guessed correctly. He took a drink, set the cup down. "You always talk this much before sunrise." "I talk when there are things that need saying." He looked at her again with that unreadable expression. Then he went and sat at the kitchen table. Not his chair, she noticed. He'd left the chair at the head of the table empty and taken the one to the right of it, which told her something she filed away. And he said, "Make your list. I'll be in town on Thursday." It was Monday. That was the first negotiation. There would be many more. The children appeared in the kitchen with the irregular, cautious energy of a group of people who had learned not to expect consistency. They came one at a time, which told Vivian they hadn't been called down together in a while. Meals had become individual events, everyone fending in their own time, which was the domestic equivalent of every man for himself. She didn't comment on it. She simply put food on the table at a set time, and when children appeared, she pointed at chairs, and when the table was full, she sat down herself and said, "We say what we're grateful for before we eat." Silas looked up. "Not to anyone in particular," Vivian added, looking at no one specifically. "Just, we say it. One thing each. That's the rule at this table." A beat of silence. "What if we're not grateful for anything?" Wyatt said. He'd come in last, leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, and he said it the way teenagers say things, testing, probing for the weak point, waiting to see if the adult would fall apart, or get angry, or do what most adults did, which was pretend the question hadn't been asked. "Then you're grateful for the biscuit," Vivian said. "Start there." He stared at her. She looked back at him and waited, which was, she was beginning to understand, the only useful tool she had with Wyatt, patience, and the refusal to fill the silence for him. He sat down. "Fine," he said. "Biscuit." Ruth said she was grateful for the fact that the biscuits smelled different from the ones Clara made, which caused Clara to make an expression that was half wounded and half relieved that someone had finally said it out loud. Thomas said he was grateful for the horses. In a voice so quiet, Vivian almost missed it. Ellie didn't say anything. She was looking at her biscuit with the focus of someone conducting serious business. And Vivian did not push her. Clara said, after a pause, that she was grateful for the coffee, because it meant she didn't have to make it. Silas looked at his plate. "Mr. Granger," Vivian said. He looked up. "One thing." Something passed over his face, something complicated and quick, like weather moving across open country. He looked like a man who hadn't been asked that question in long enough that he'd forgotten it was a question people asked. "The rain held off last night," he said finally. "Needed it to." It wasn't much, but it was something. Vivian let it stand. She didn't look at Wyatt, but she heard him pick up his biscuit, and she counted that as a small and significant victory. The week had a shape to it that she hadn't anticipated, which was probably her own fault for anticipating too specifically. She'd expected resistance. She got resistance, but not from the direction she'd braced for. Wyatt, after the biscuit conversation, went cool rather than hostile. He stopped taking direct shots at her and started simply not being wherever she was, which required a level of logistical effort she actually found impressive. He was never rude. He just arranged himself so that their paths crossed as infrequently as possible in a house that wasn't large enough to make that easy. Thomas, the 9-year-old, was a different kind of puzzle. He was present in body and absent in every other sense. A quiet boy who moved through rooms like he was trying not to disturb anything, ate what was put in front of him, answered questions in full sentences that somehow conveyed nothing, and spent the majority of his time outside near the horses. On Wednesday morning, Vivian got up early enough to see him through the kitchen window, standing in the paddock in the gray pre-dawn light, with his forehead pressed against the neck of a bay mare, just standing there. And she understood something about Thomas Granger that no question would have told her. He was grieving in the one place that felt safe. The horses didn't ask him to be okay. She left him alone with that. Ruth was the loud one, which was both a relief and an ongoing exercise in patience. She had opinions about everything, and the conversational self-restraint of a 6-year-old, which is to say, none. She told Vivian on Tuesday that the previous housekeeper had smelled like onions. She told her on Wednesday that her father didn't sleep enough because she could hear him walking around at night. She told her on Thursday morning, with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone relaying the weather, that Clara cried sometimes when she thought nobody could hear her. Vivian listened to all of it without reacting, which was harder than it sounded. Clara was the one who broke Vivian's heart on a slow schedule. She was 12 years old, and she had taken on, without being asked and without being thanked, the invisible labor of holding the household together in the only ways a 12-year-old could. She knew where everything was. She knew which of Thomas's shirts had a tear in the left sleeve. She knew that Ruth had nightmares on nights when there was wind and needed someone to come in and sit with her. She had been functioning as the memory and the conscience and the emotional backbone of the family for 14 months, and the weight of it was visible in her. Not in any dramatic way, but in the way she moved, the way she watched, the way she got up before she was asked, and sat down only after everyone else was settled. On Thursday afternoon, Vivian found her trying to rehem one of Ellie's dresses with thread that was the wrong color and stitching that was coming loose at every third stitch, and she sat down across from her without being invited and said, "Show me what you're doing." Clara looked at her with that guarded expression. "I know how to sew." "I didn't say you didn't. Show me anyway." A pause. Then Clara held up the dress. Vivian looked at the stitching for a moment. "You're pulling too tight," she said. "When the fabric moves, it's going to pull loose again." "I know that. I don't have the right thread, and I can't—" She stopped. "Can't what?" Clara pressed her lips together. She was 12 years old, and she was not going to cry in front of someone she'd known for 4 days. Vivian respected that completely. She reached over and took the dress and the needle from Clara's hands. Not forcefully, just calmly, the way you take something from someone when you're going to help them with it. And she rethreaded the needle with a different tension and showed Clara the stitch before she made it. "Like that," she said. "See how much slack I'm leaving?" Clara watched. Then she reached over and took it back. She made the next 3 stitches herself, better than the ones before. She didn't say thank you, and Vivian didn't need her to. The first real confrontation with Silas happened on Friday. It was about the children's chores, which, in Vivian's assessment after 5 days of watching, had been assigned in a way that made theoretical sense and practical no sense at all. Wyatt was responsible for things that took him away from the house and yard for hours at a time. Clara was responsible for things that kept her indoors when she should have been outside, in school, or just being 12. The younger children had no responsibilities at all, which meant they were learning, at an age when children learn things permanently, that life was something that happened to you rather than something you participated in. She brought it up after supper when the children had cleared. She had started requiring that the children clear their own plates, which had caused a brief revolt on Tuesday that she had outlasted through sheer refusal to engage with it. And Silas was having his second coffee and looking at his ledger. "I want to change how the chores are divided," she said. He didn't look up. "The chores are how they are." "The chores are how they were when your wife set them up, which was when the children were different ages and the household was in different condition." He looked up then. "Ruth is old enough to gather eggs," Vivian continued. "Thomas is old enough to fill the wood box. Clara shouldn't be doing laundry alone, but that's a full-day job for a grown woman, and it's been falling to a 12-year-old. Clara manages. Clara manages because she doesn't have a choice. That's not the same as managing being appropriate for her to do." His jaw tightened. "Miss Mercer, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but the running of this household is—" "Is what?" she said evenly. "Yours? Yes. I know that. I'm not trying to take it from you. I'm telling you what I see after 5 days because you hired me, presumably, for the use of my judgment as much as my labor." He was quiet for a moment. His coffee cup was still in his hand, and he set it down with the care of a man deciding whether to be angry. "What are you suggesting?" he said finally. "A list. I'll write it out and you can approve or change what you like. But the current arrangement is burning Clara out and underutilizing Wyatt in ways that aren't useful for either of them." A long pause. "What do you mean, underutilizing Wyatt?" "He's 15. He's strong and capable, and he's spending half his energy making sure he's never in the same room as me. That's a waste of a person." She paused. "He needs work that means something, not just tasks. Something he can point to and say, 'I did that. That stands because of me.'" Silas stared at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not agreement exactly. More like the look of a man who has just heard something he already knew said out loud by someone else, which is a different thing entirely. "The north fence," he said quietly. "That's what I'd suggest." He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. And when Saturday morning came and Vivian mentioned to Wyatt at breakfast, casually, while refilling his coffee without asking if he wanted it, which he did, that his father had said the north fence post needed resetting and was planning to get to it when he had time, she watched Wyatt's face go through 3 different expressions in about 4 seconds. He showed up in the north pasture that afternoon with a post hole digger and didn't come in until dark, and he ate 3 portions at supper without saying a word about it. But when Silas looked at him across the table and said, "Good work on the fence," something in Wyatt's wall developed a crack. Just one. Small. But cracks are where things start. The end of the week came on Sunday, and Vivian had not forgotten her own terms. 1 week, she sat with it on Saturday night in the narrow bed in the room off the kitchen, and she was honest with herself the way she'd been making herself be honest since Ohio. The situation was not what the advertisement had said. That was still true. The work was harder than housekeeping, wider than housekeeping, and the emotional weight of it was the kind of weight that didn't show up in any job description and didn't come with any extra pay. Also true, she had nowhere better to go. Also true, and this was the one she turned over most carefully before she put it down and looked at it. She didn't want to leave. Not because of Silas. She was scrupulous about that in her own mind. I was not an easy man and she did not trust him yet, and the lie of the advertisement sat in her like a splinter, still. Not because of the ranch, which was more work than she'd signed up for and showed no signs of becoming less. Because of Ellie, who on Friday evening had climbed up into the chair next to Vivian's at the kitchen table while Vivian was mending and had sat there in silence for 40 minutes, not asking for anything, just there, present, close enough to touch. Because of Ruth, who had asked her that morning whether she was going to stay, and who had then, before Vivian could answer, said very quickly, "You don't have to answer that, I'm just asking," which was the most heartbreaking form of self-protection Vivian had encountered in a child in a long time. Because of Clara's improving stitches, and Thomas's early mornings with the mare, and Wyatt's cracked wall, and even Silas Granger sitting at the wrong chair at the head of his own table and pretending that was just the way he liked it. She lay on her back in the narrow bed and she looked at the ceiling and she thought, 1 more week. She'd give it 1 more week, just to see. She was already giving it more than that, and she knew it, and she was not quite ready to admit it to herself, so she called it 1 more week and left it there. It was on the 8th day that she understood the size of what she had walked into. A neighbor came by that afternoon, Margaret Holt, from the ranch to the east, which was 3 miles off and apparently close enough for visiting in this part of Texas. She was a broad, practical woman in her 50s who arrived on a bay horse with the confidence of someone who had been doing exactly what she pleased for several decades and intended to continue. She tied her horse at the post, came up to the door, knocked twice, and when Vivian opened it, she looked her over with the frank assessment of someone who is going to form an opinion whether you like it or not. "You're the new one," Margaret said. "Vivian Mercer." Margaret Holt, I knew Helen. She said it plainly, the way you say the name of someone who is gone. No dramatics, just acknowledgement. She was a good woman. This place was something when she was running it. She looked past Vivian into the hallway. Vivian stepped back and let her in, because there wasn't a graceful alternative. Margaret walked through the front hall and looked at the kitchen, which was, by day 8, considerably improved from the catastrophe Vivian had walked into, and nodded once. "You've been busy," she said. "There was a lot to do." "The last 2 didn't do it." "No." Margaret looked at her with those frank, steady eyes. "How long are you planning to stay?" "I haven't decided." That's an honest answer. She sat down at the kitchen table as though she'd been doing it for years, which she may have been. "Can I tell you something, and have you hear it without taking offense?" "You can try," Vivian said. Margaret almost smiled. Half this county had given up on this place. On Silas too, truth be told. He doesn't let people in. Hasn't since Helen died. And those children. She stopped, shook her head. Clara rode over to my place in February asking if she could borrow a cup of lard because they'd run out, and she was trying to make biscuits for the little ones. And she was 12 years old and her coat didn't fit because it was from 2 winters ago, and she didn't ask me for anything else because she's too proud, same as her father. Vivian set 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat down. "I'm telling you," Margaret continued, "because whatever you've decided or not decided, what you're doing here matters, even if it doesn't feel like it yet, even if he doesn't say it." She picked up her coffee. He won't say it. You should know that going in. That man will eat his own pride before he says thank you to someone who deserves it. Vivian thought about Silas at the kitchen table, sitting in the wrong chair. I've met that type before, she said. Most women have. Margaret drank her coffee. That doesn't mean they're not worth the trouble. It just means the trouble is real. She stayed for an hour. She talked about the county, about the dry spring, and what it was likely to mean for summer, about her own husband who had died 8 years ago and left her with a working ranch, and the discovery that she was better at running it than he had been. She was, Vivian decided, the most useful kind of person, direct, experienced, and not inclined to make things prettier than they were. When she left, Silas had come in from the pasture in time to see her riding away, and he stopped at the kitchen doorway with an expression that said he knew exactly what had been discussed and was not sure whether to be grateful or mortified. She talk your ear off? He asked. She was informative, Vivian said. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, went to the stove to pour himself coffee, which he had recently stopped waiting for someone to bring him and started getting himself, which Vivian thought was probably a sign of something. He stood at the stove with his back to her and drank for a moment. She meant well, he said. She's always meant well. She clearly cared about your wife. A pause. She did. And she cares about your children. Another pause. I know. Vivian watched his back, the torn shoulder of his shirt still only half mended. She had a needle and thread and had been considering whether it was overstepping to fix it without being asked. She had decided it was, and then changed her mind twice since. Mr. Granger, she said. He turned around. I've decided to stay past the week. He looked at her. His expression went through something she couldn't track completely. Relief was in there, and something more complicated that she didn't try to name. All right, he said, I have conditions. Of course you do. The children need regular routines. Set meal times, set bedtimes, set chores, not negotiations every day. Structure. Children need to know what to expect, especially these ones. He nodded. And I need a better basin in that room. The one that's in there has a crack that's going to get worse. He almost smiled, just almost. Anything else? Clara needs school. I don't know what the situation is with schooling in this county, but she is 12 years old and she should be learning things that aren't just how to run a house. Something crossed his face at that. Something she identified after a moment as guilt. Real guilt. The kind that knows exactly what it is and where it came from. There's a schoolhouse in Halden, he said. 6 miles. Then she goes. It's 6 miles, Miss Mercer. Then she goes 3 days a week, and I teach her the other 2. I am not without education, Mr. Granger. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back with the expression that she had learned over 8 days was the right one to use with Silas Granger. Not aggressive, not soft, just certain. 3 days a week, he said finally. Starting next week. Starting next week. She nodded once, picked up her mending. He stood there for another moment, as if there was something else he meant to say, and then he didn't say it, and he took his coffee and went back to his office. She sat at the kitchen table, and she did not let herself think too hard about what she had just agreed to, because thinking too hard about it would make it large. And large things had a way of frightening her if she looked at them directly. Better to take them in pieces. Better to take them 1 week at a time. From somewhere upstairs she heard Ruth singing to herself. Some song she'd clearly made up, with lyrics about a horse and a biscuit and a lady named Viv, which was apparently how Ruth had decided to shorten her name. Ellie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightdress, barefoot on the floor, holding her folded handkerchief. She looked at Vivian. Vivian looked back. Then Ellie walked across the kitchen with the deliberate, serious steps of a 4-year-old who has made a decision, climbed up into the chair beside Vivian, and leaned her small, warm weight against Vivian's arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Vivian sat very still for a moment, the mending in her hands and the child against her side, and she felt something shift in the center of herself. Not dramatically, not with any of the grace that stories give to moments like this. Just a quiet, irreversible tilting. She was staying. She had known it for days. It just took Ellie 4 years old and 37 pounds to make her say it to herself. She put her arm around the child very gently and went back to her mending. And outside the window, the last light was going off the Texas sky in streaks of orange and copper, and Iron Creek Ranch, for the first time in 14 months, had the particular quality of silence that isn't empty, the kind of silence that happens when a house is full of people, and they're all, for this one moment, where they're supposed to be. The weeks after that did not transform Iron Creek Ranch the way stories sometimes suggest, all at once, like a fever breaking. It was slower than that, and messier, and there were days when Vivian went to bed feeling like she had moved nothing forward at all, like the whole weight of the place had simply absorbed her effort and given nothing back. But there were other days. Clara came home from her first day at the Halden schoolhouse with ink on 3 fingers and a look on her face that Vivian recognized, the look of someone who has been given back something they didn't know had been taken. She didn't say much about it. She sat at the kitchen table that evening and did figures on a piece of paper that wasn't household accounting, and that was enough. Thomas started leaving carrots on the fence post by the paddock, just setting them there in the morning without explanation, and the bay mare would have them gone by mid-afternoon. Vivian noticed but didn't mention it. Ruth mentioned it loudly, and Thomas went red and disappeared, and the next morning the carrots were still there. Wyatt reset the entire north fence line over the course of a week and a half, and on the last day Silas walked out to look at it and stood there for a long time without saying anything, and Wyatt stood beside him also without saying anything, and what passed between them in that silence was something Vivian couldn't name and didn't try to. Some things between fathers and sons don't need naming. They just need to happen. Ellie had started sleeping through the night. That one Vivian only knew because Ruth told her, in the way Ruth told her everything, without preamble, as a statement of fact. Ellie used to wake up crying almost every night, Ruth said one morning, watching Vivian braid her hair, which had become a daily ritual that Ruth had engineered so gradually, Vivian hadn't noticed it becoming a requirement until it already was. She doesn't do it as much anymore. That's good, Vivian said. She stopped doing it around when you came. Vivian kept braiding. I'm not saying you did it, Ruth added. I know. I'm just saying when. I know, Ruth. Ruth was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Do you think she misses her? Vivian's hands didn't stop moving. Yes, I think she does. I think about her too, but I can't remember her face very well anymore, and that makes me feel bad. The braid was nearly done. Vivian tied it off with the piece of ribbon Ruth had selected that morning. Green, always green. Ruth had a commitment to green ribbon that was absolute and non-negotiable, and she set her hands on Ruth's shoulders for a moment. That's not a bad thing, Vivian said. That means you're living forward. She'd want you to. Ruth thought about this with the seriousness that Ruth brought to most things despite her loudness. Okay, she said finally. And then she slid off the chair and went to find Thomas to tell him something that apparently couldn't wait, and Vivian sat for a moment with her hands in her lap before she got up and went back to work. These were the small things, the accumulations, the unremarkable daily movements of a household learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to be a household again. What she hadn't accounted for, what she hadn't let herself think about too directly, was Silas. It was not an easy man to know. She had understood that from the first day, and the weeks that followed didn't revise the understanding so much as complicate it. He was up before dawn every morning and often not back until past dark, and the ranch was large enough and the work constant enough that this was genuinely necessary and not avoidance, though Vivian suspected it was both things at once, and she didn't blame him for that. He was not a talker. The conversations they had were functional, mostly, about supplies, about the children, about what needed doing and when. He asked for her opinion on things with a directness that she appreciated, and then argued with whatever she said, which she also appreciated, because she was not looking for agreement so much as engagement, and arguing was engagement. He was not, as far as she could tell, a man who had ever said what he felt about much of anything. She saw evidence of the person he might have been, sometimes. On the evenings he came in early enough to sit at the table while she was finishing supper, she would hear him answer one of Ruth's relentless questions, and something in his voice would go different. Not soft, exactly, but less defended. He had a dry humor that he exercised rarely, and with such restraint that you could miss it if you weren't paying attention. He missed it, sometimes, himself. One evening in early November, she caught him standing in the doorway of the room where Clara was helping Ellie with something, some small project with paper and paste, and he had the expression of a man looking at something he'd been afraid to look at directly for a long time. Not happiness, not sadness, quite. something that sat between them and contained both. He didn't know she saw it. She didn't say anything about it. What she was careful about, scrupulously, deliberately careful, was the line between the work she had come here to do and the personal territory she had not been invited into. She kept the household. She structured the children's days. She made the ranch function. She did not presume on anything beyond that. She was very careful. She was also aware, with the part of herself that was honest regardless of what was convenient. That being careful about a line is its own kind of acknowledgement that the line is there to be crossed. She did not let herself examine that too closely. And then the storm came, and the careful line became irrelevant. It started on a Thursday evening in mid-November. The sky had been wrong all day. That particular quality of wrong that people who live close to the land learn to read the way others read print, a yellowish heaviness in the air, a stillness that didn't feel like calm, but like something holding its breath. Silas had said at supper, "Storm coming, could be bad." He'd looked at Wyatt. "Animals are in?" "All but the 2 mares in the north pasture," Wyatt said. "We'll get them in after supper." They did. Vivian watched from the window as the 2 of them went out together in the thickening dark, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who have done the same thing many times. She got the younger children to bed early, Ruth argued. Ellie didn't. Thomas went without a word. And she banked the fire high and set the extra candles out where they'd be easy to find. By 10 o'clock, the wind had found its voice. By 11, it was something else entirely. She had been in storms before. Ohio had its own. But this was a different scale of thing. The sound of it was constant and physical, a pressure as much as a noise, and the house shook with gusts that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The windows held, but the light under the front door flickered with each impact of wind, and somewhere outside something had come loose and was beating rhythmically against the side of the barn. Wyatt came in just before midnight, soaked through despite his coat, his face tight. "He's not back," he said. Vivian looked at him. "Your father." "He went back out. One of the horses got spooked, went for the fence again. He said he'd be 10 minutes. Wyatt's jaw was set in a way that looked like his father's, and was covering the same thing his father used it to cover. "That was 40 minutes ago." She didn't say anything immediately. She looked at the window, which was showing her nothing but darkness and the chaos of the storm. And she did what she did when things required decision. She set aside the feeling part of it and thought through the practical part. "You know where he would have gone," she said. "The northwest corner of the near pasture. That's where the fence has been weak." "How far?" 200 yards from the barn. Maybe less." "Is there a lantern?" "Miss Mercer." "Is there a lantern in the barn?" Wyatt stared at her. "Yes, but you can't go out in this. I'll go." "You'll stay with your brothers and sisters." She said it in a tone that left no opening. "If something happens to both of you—" She didn't finish that sentence. She didn't need to. Wyatt understood it. She could see him understand it. And she could see it was the right argument because his face showed the thing he would never say, which was that the thought had already occurred to him, and he'd been trying to outweigh it with the other one. He was 15 years old, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the cool, not the wall, but something stripped of both. Something genuinely frightened. "He's been out there a long time," Wyatt said. "I know." She was already putting on her coat. "You stay in this house. You do not come out no matter what. Do you hear me?" "Yes." "Wyatt." He looked at her. "He's going to be fine," she said. She said it the way she'd learned to say difficult things. Not with false certainty, but with enough steadiness to be useful. "I just need to find him." She went out into the storm. There are moments where you realize what a person is made of, and usually those moments are not chosen. They arrive because there is no other option. And what you do in them is not a decision so much as a revelation of decisions you have already made, accumulated quietly, that you didn't know you'd made until you had to act on them. The wind was a force with weight to it. She bent into it and kept her eyes narrow against the debris the air was carrying, grit and straw, and the small, hard pieces of things that had broken loose. The lantern she'd taken from just inside the barn door threw a circle of light that the wind was constantly trying to take from her, and she kept her body curved around it the way you'd protect something necessary. She made it to the barn. Nothing. The horses were in their stalls, restless and wide-eyed but there, and the barn door on the far side was swinging. Someone had gone through and hadn't had the hands free to latch it behind them. She went through it. The northwest corner of the near pasture, 200 yards that felt like more because she was walking against the wind, and the ground was already wet and uncertain underfoot, and the darkness beyond the lantern's range was complete. She called his name twice, and the wind ate both of them before they'd gone 6 feet. She almost missed him. She would have missed him if the lantern hadn't caught, for just a moment in a lull between gusts, the pale color of his shirt against the dark ground. He was down. He was on his side near the broken section of fence, and the fence post, a solid cedar post that had been standing for years until tonight, had come down across him, pinning his left arm underneath. She got to him in seconds. "Silas!" He was conscious, barely or maybe fully. It was hard to tell because his eyes were open, but the pain was consuming most of his attention. He looked at her with an expression that was completely unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before, because pain does that. It strips away the managed surface of a person and shows you what's underneath. "Arm," he said. "I see it. I need to get this post off you." "Bad break." "Let me see." "Vivian." It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed it and set it aside. The post was not as heavy as it looked. It was old. An old cedar goes dry and lighter than it appears. She got her hands under it and moved it in 2 pulls, and he made a sound when it came free that told her everything she needed to know about the severity of the break. She crouched down beside him and got the lantern close and looked. The forearm was wrong. Not just swollen, the angle was wrong, a displacement that she identified with a cold and practical clarity. Because in the 3 years she had spent in Ohio helping at a frontier clinic before things fell apart there, she had seen broken bones set, and she had assisted at enough of them to know what needed to happen and why it needed to happen before he went into shock. She did not have time to be uncertain about it. Uncertainty in a moment like this was a luxury the situation wasn't offering. "I'm going to need you to be very still," she said. She was taking off her coat as she spoke, not from warmth. There was no warmth out here, but because she needed the sleeves. "I'm going to straighten this and splint it before we move you. If we try to move you first, we risk more damage." He looked at her. "I know what I'm doing," she said. "I didn't say—" "Your face did. Look at me. I have done this before. Not many times, but enough. I need you to breathe and be still." He was quiet for a moment. Another gust hit them, and she braced over him, keeping the lantern low. Then he said, "All right. This is going to hurt." "I gathered that." She set the arm. She did it the way she'd been taught, quickly, with a clean and decisive movement, because hesitation makes it worse. And he made a sound and then silence. And when she looked at his face, he was gray-white and sweating and breathing through his nose in the controlled, shallow way of someone managing the edge of their limits. She worked fast after that, the coat sleeves tied tight, the fence rail section as a brace. Not good. Not clean or neat or anything like what a doctor would do, but solid enough to hold for the distance they had to travel. "Can you stand?" she said, "with help." She got him up. He was significantly larger than her, half a foot taller, outweighed her by a great deal, and getting him upright required both of them working together, him using his right arm and she taking as much of his left side as she could manage. He was unsteady for a moment. She didn't comment on it. "Barn first," she said, "then the house. Don't talk, just walk." "You're giving me a lot of orders tonight," he said. "You're in a poor position to object." Something flickered in his expression despite everything. She didn't let herself think about that. She focused on getting them through the gate and across the wet ground and into the barn, and from the barn through the far door and across the remaining distance to the house, which took longer than it should have because the wind was still fighting them and his arm was requiring constant management to keep from being jarred. Wyatt had the front door open before they reached the porch. He took one look at his father's arm and went the color of old ash. "He's all right," Vivian said. "He needs the table cleared and something flat to lie on, and I need the medicine box, the one on the high shelf in the kitchen. Get it." Wyatt got it. She worked on Silas at the kitchen table for the better part of an hour, properly cleaning the skin where the post had caught him, checking the set she'd done in the field, bracing it correctly this time, with the flat board she'd sent Wyatt for, and strapping it so it would hold. Silas sat through all of it without complaint, which told her his pain tolerance was extraordinary, and also that he had decided, somewhere out in that pasture, to trust her. The children had appeared at the kitchen doorway. All of them. Wyatt had gotten them up, or the noise had, or the instinct children have for when something significant is happening. They stood in a row, Ruth clutching Thomas's sleeve, Ellie with her handkerchief, Clara with her hand over her mouth. "He's going to be fine," Vivian said, without turning around. "Go back to bed." Nobody moved. "Clara, take Ellie. Ellie, Thomas, take Ruth. Wyatt, stay." Clara moved. She came forward and took Ellie's hand and said something quiet to her and led her away. And Thomas, without a word, just his hand gently taking Ruth's shoulder, went with them. Ruth went, which was significant. Wyatt stayed. He stood against the wall while Vivian finished, and Silas sat there with his eyes closed. And when she was done, she stepped back and looked at her work and decided it would hold until morning when they could get a doctor. "Thank you," Silas said. She looked at him. I was looking at her with that stripped expression again. No management, no distance. Just a man who had been in real danger and knew it, and knew who had come out in the storm to find him. "You would have done the same," she said. "Maybe," he paused. "But you didn't have to." She started cleaning up. Wyatt was still against the wall, and she looked at him and saw something that she had not seen in his face before. Not the crack in the wall, but the complete and temporary absence of it, the face underneath, which was just a 15-year-old boy who had been terrified and was not yet finished being terrified, and was trying to hold himself together in the way that boys his age believe they're supposed to. "Come sit down," she said to him. "I'm fine." "Wyatt." He looked at her. "Come sit down," she said more quietly. He came and sat down at the table across from his father, and he looked at Silas's arm in its splint, and Silas looked at him, and Vivian moved to put the kettle on because it was 3 a.m, and they all needed something warm and she needed something to do with her hands. "I'm all right, son," Silas said. Wyatt's jaw worked. He nodded. "She did good work," Silas added. Wyatt looked at Vivian. It was a different kind of looking than she was used to from him. No assessment, no testing, just looking. "Yeah," he said. The storm ran itself out some time before dawn. By the time the light came back, the wind had dropped to something ordinary, and the sky had gone the washed-clean gray of a morning after, and Iron Creek Ranch was wet and scattered with debris but standing. Silas slept for 2 hours on the settle with his arm propped and his color returning slowly to something closer to normal. Wyatt slept in his chair at the kitchen table and did not argue about it when it happened, which told Vivian how exhausted he was. She sat up. Not because she had to. Because she wasn't ready to stop watching the both of them, to reassure herself with the rise and fall of breathing that they were there and unhurt, and the night had not taken anything it couldn't be made to give back. By mid-morning, when the children came downstairs and Silas was sitting up and eating, not much, but some, and Ruth had climbed onto the settle beside him and inserted herself under his good arm with the proprietary air of a child staking a claim she'd been afraid to stake, and he had closed his arm around her and said nothing, just held her while he ate. By mid-morning, when all of that was happening around the kitchen table, and the storm was over and the light was coming in through the windows that it held, Vivian stood at the stove and she understood that something had crossed a threshold the night before that was not going to uncross. She hadn't saved this family. She knew better than to think in terms like that. The family was saving itself, in all the small and imperfect and daily ways that families do. But she had gone out into the storm, and she had brought Silas Granger home. And whatever the nature of the line she had been so careful about before, whatever distance she had thought she was maintaining between the work she was here to do and the people she was doing it for, that distance had closed. Not because of one night. One night doesn't change things, but one night can make visible what is already changed, and she stood at that stove and was honest with herself, the way she had promised herself in Ohio she would always be, and she acknowledged what was visible. Ellie appeared at her side. She had her handkerchief folded in her left hand, and with her right hand she reached up and took hold of the edge of Vivian's apron. She just held on. Vivian covered Ellie's hand with her own and stood there, and the kitchen was full of the particular noise of a family recovering. Ruth talking, Clara pouring, Thomas appearing from somewhere with the quietness that was just his nature, Wyatt eating more than anyone at the table and pretending not to notice that Vivian noticed. And Silas looked across the kitchen at her with an expression she had never seen from him before. Not gratitude, exactly. Not quite. Something larger than that, and more complicated, and she was not ready to look at it directly. She turned back to the stove. She told herself she would look at it another time, when things were settled, when she wasn't tired all the way into her bones from a night of not sleeping. She told herself that. But she was already looking, and she already knew what she saw, and the only question now was what she was going to do with knowing it. The doctor came out from Halden the next morning, a lean, unhurried man named Aldridge, who had the practiced calm of someone who had seen enough frontier injuries to be unsurprisable. He looked at Vivian's field work with the expression of a man expecting to find something to criticize and not finding it, which was its own form of compliment. "Whoever set this did it right," he said, not looking up from the arm. "She did," Silas said, from the settle where he'd been relocated with considerably less dignity than he would have preferred. Aldridge looked at Vivian. She said nothing. He nodded once, the way competent people acknowledge competence, briefly, without decoration, and went back to his work. The arm would heal. 6 weeks minimum, Aldridge said. No heavy labor, no riding, no fence posts, no hauling, nothing that required 2 functional hands, which on a working ranch meant almost everything. Silas received this information with the expression of a man being told his house is on fire. 6 weeks, he repeated. At least, Aldridge said, closing his bag. I have a ranch to run. You have a right arm and 4 functional children. Aldridge looked at him with the patient authority of a man who knew exactly how stubborn his patients were going to be and had stopped being interested in pretending otherwise. Miss Mercer, he is going to try to use that arm before 6 weeks. When he does, remind him I can reset it less carefully next time. Vivian said, I'll remind him. Silas looked at her. Don't, she said. He didn't. Oh. The weeks that followed the storm were different in ways that were hard to measure, but impossible to miss. Part of it was practical. With Silas's left arm in a splint and his range of usefulness sharply reduced, the ranch required everyone to carry more, and Vivian had to reorganize the daily labor of the household in ways that reached beyond what she'd established before. Wyatt took on work that had been his father's. Not all of it, but enough that he was out before sunrise and in after dark most days. And the thing that had been building in him since that first fence repair was now undeniable. He was growing into something. She watched it happen the way you watch a tree in late spring, not day by day, but in the aggregate, looking up one morning and finding it further along than you expected. He started asking her things. Not questions about the house or the chores, questions. About Ohio, about what she'd done at the clinic there, about how she'd learned what she knew. He asked in the offhand, indirect way of teenagers who don't want you to know they're interested in the answer, but he asked, and she answered with the same directness she brought to everything. And somewhere in the middle of those conversations, the wall came down so gradually that neither of them could have said when it happened. One evening, in late November, he came in from the pasture and stood in the kitchen doorway while she was finishing supper, mud on his boots and his hair pushed back from the cold, and he said, Miss Mercer. She turned. I was wrong, he said. About you. When you first came. He said it the way his father would have said something difficult. Not easily, but completely. No hedging. I thought you'd be like the others. I know, she said. You weren't. I know that too. He nodded. Something settled in his expression. Some account he'd been keeping internally, now balanced. He came in and washed his hands at the basin and sat down at the table, and that was the end of it, which was exactly the right length for that kind of conversation. Silas, confined to lighter duties and visibly hating it, began to do something she hadn't expected. He started being present. Not because he had decided to, she thought, more because the injury had removed the mechanism of absence, the constant physical labor that took him away from the house and from his children for most of the day. Without that, he had to be somewhere, and somewhere was mostly the house, and the house was where the children were. And the children, given the physical presence of their father on a daily basis for the first time in longer than any of them wanted to calculate, adjusted to it the way living things adjust to a change in conditions, tentatively at first, and then with increasing confidence. Thomas began talking at meals. Not much, not the way Ruth talked, but he would make a statement, about the horses usually, or something he'd seen in the pasture. And Silas would respond, and there would be a brief, functional exchange that was nothing like the conversations most people picture when they think of fathers and sons. but was real and direct and built of the specific vocabulary two people develop when they share a care for the same animals. Vivian stayed out of those conversations deliberately. They were not hers. She served the food and listened and kept Ruth from derailing them, which was a full-time task in itself. Clara was the one who worried her that month, quietly and persistently. She was doing better in most visible respects. Her schoolwork was coming along. She'd brought home a spelling paper in late November with a near-perfect score and laid it on the kitchen table with studied casualness, waiting to be noticed. And Vivian had noticed and said so in specific terms. Not just good job, but you've been working at this, which was different, and Clara knew the difference. Her stitching had improved. She'd stopped getting up before everyone else to preemptively do the work that was no longer hers to carry alone. But there were moments, not many, not dramatic, when Vivian would catch her watching Silas and Vivian in the same room together with an expression that was careful and assessing in a way that wasn't quite 12 years old. More like a person doing a calculation, checking a set of variables against a possible outcome. She'd been her mother's eldest daughter. She had watched Helen Granger run this household and be the center of it, and then she had watched that center disappear and the whole structure come apart, and she had done what Clara did. She had tried to become it herself, the center, because someone had to. And now there was someone else here, and that someone else was competent and permanent seeming, and her father looked at that person with an expression he hadn't used since before. Vivian understood all of this. She understood it didn't require confronting. It required time and consistency and proof that what Clara feared, the shifting of attachments, the displacement of her mother's memory, was not what was actually happening. She started asking Clara for help with things she didn't strictly need help with. Not invented tasks, real ones, just ones she could have handled alone. The preserves for winter, the mending inventory, the assessment of what the younger children needed in the way of clothing before the deep cold set in. She did it matter-of-factly, as a colleague consults another colleague, not as an adult manages a child. And Clara's response to that, the incremental, grudging, eventually genuine opening of it, was the thing Vivian was quietly most proud of in all of those weeks. One afternoon in early they were in the kitchen together, going through the preserve shelf, Clara making notes on a piece of paper and Vivian counting jars. And Clara said, without preamble and without looking up from her paper, "Were you married before?" Vivian didn't stop counting. "No." "Were you close to it?" She paused on that one. "Once. It didn't happen." Clara was quiet for a moment. What was wrong with him? Nothing was wrong with him. He was a decent man. The timing was wrong, and some other things were wrong, and it didn't come to anything. "Were you sad?" "For a while." She moved to the next shelf. Being sad about something and being wrong about something aren't the same. Clara thought about this. Then she said carefully, "My mother she was the kind of person who made everything make sense. When she was here, everything made sense." Vivian listened. "It doesn't make sense the same way now," Clara said. "Even now that things are better, it's not the same kind of sense." "No," Vivian said. "It won't be that same kind. It can't be." "Does that bother you, that it's different because of you?" It was a 12-year-old asking, but it was also not a 12-year-old asking. It was the eldest daughter of a dead woman asking the person who was changing what the house felt like, and it deserved an honest answer. "Yes," Vivian said. "Sometimes it does." Clara looked up. "I'm not trying to make it a different thing than it is," Vivian said. "I'm not trying to be what she was. I wouldn't be good at that, and I wouldn't try. But I understand that having me here changes things. I think about that." A long pause. The clock on the shelf ticked. Outside, Ruth was loudly explaining something to Thomas, who had clearly not asked for the explanation. "She would have liked you," Clara said finally. "I think." Vivian didn't respond immediately. She kept counting jars. "That's a very generous thing to say," she said. "I'm not being generous," Clara said, with the frank certainty of someone stating a fact. She liked people who didn't fuss. "You don't fuss." Vivian thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. December moved through the ranch with a cold that had edges to it. The garden was long dead, but Vivian had salvaged more from it in the fall than the household had expected, jarred and stored and accounted for in the inventory she and Clara had made. The wood box was never allowed to fall below half. Ellie had begun talking more, small, declarative sentences delivered with the seriousness of a 4-year-old making official announcements, and each one was received by whoever was nearest with the gravity it clearly deserved. Silas's arm was healing ahead of schedule, which Aldridge confirmed on his December visit with a satisfaction that suggested he was more invested in Vivian's fieldwork than he'd let on. The splint was reduced, the restriction modified, and Silas immediately pushed every boundary of the new restriction within 48 hours, which surprised no one. "I told you," she said, when she came in from hanging laundry to find him moving hay bales with his one usable arm in a way that was clearly straining the healing one. "I'm using my right arm." "You're compensating with your left and you know it. Stop." He stopped. He set down the bale with the specific quality of a man setting something down to prove he chose to set it down and not because he was told to. "You are the most stubborn patient I have ever encountered," she said. "I've only been your patient once." That was enough to establish the pattern. He turned around. He was looking at her with that look again, the one she'd been careful not to examine too directly since the night of the storm. She'd gotten better at not examining it, which was the same as getting worse at being honest with herself, and she knew it. "Vivian," he said. "Don't," she said. "I haven't said anything yet." "I know what you're going to say." "Do you? You're going to say something about that night, or about staying, or about—" She stopped, picked up the laundry basket. "Not yet, Silas." It was the first time she had used his given name. It landed between them with a weight neither of them commented on. "Not yet," he repeated. "There are things that need to still be what they are for a while longer." She wasn't sure she was explaining it well. She wasn't sure she could. "I need to know that what's between us is that it's not just circumstance, that it's real and that I can trust it to still be there when things are settled." He was quiet, watching her. "Does that make sense?" she said. "Yes," he said. After a moment, "I'm not known for my patience." "I know, but I'll try." She believed him. She believed him because he said it the way he said things he meant, without flourish, without softening it into something more comfortable. Just the plain statement of intention. She went inside, and she was very careful with herself for the rest of that day, and the day after, and the one after that. It was Margaret Holt who caused the first real rupture of December. She came by on a Wednesday afternoon with a woman Vivian had not met, a Mrs. Dora Finch, from the town of Halden, whose husband ran the feed store and who was apparently a person of some social consequence in the county. Mrs. Finch was pleasant in the specific way of people who have decided to be pleasant and want you to notice the decision. She had small, quick eyes that were doing more work than her smile was. They sat in the front room, which Vivian had restored to a state of modest order over the preceding weeks, and Vivian served coffee and listened to the conversation, which was about the county and the winter and the general business of the community, and she understood after about 10 minutes that Mrs. Finch had come to assess her. Not unkindly, just with the thoroughness of a woman who keeps track of things. "It must be quite the responsibility," Mrs. Finch said, looking at Vivian with those busy eyes. "A household this size." "It's honest work," Vivian said. "Of course." A small pause. "And with Mr. Granger's injury, I imagine you've been carrying a great deal." "Everyone's carried more. The children especially." "Yes." Another pause. "It must be a delicate situation. For you, professionally speaking." She said professionally speaking with an inflection that suggested she meant several other things. Margaret, to her credit, looked like she was considering saying something sharp, and then apparently decided to let Vivian handle it. "I find it straightforward," Vivian said, looking at Mrs. Finch with the calm she used when someone was trying to find a soft spot. "Well, yes," Mrs. Finch recovered smoothly. "I only meant a woman in your position, without family here. I hope you feel the community has been welcoming." "Margaret has been welcoming," Vivian said, "and the children have been welcoming in their way. That's been sufficient." After they left, Margaret stayed. She sat in the kitchen while Vivian washed the cups, and there was a silence between them that had something specific in it. "She's not malicious," Margaret said finally. "I know, she's curious, and she wants to get the story settled before it settles itself. People talk. People always talk. About you, about Silas." Margaret paused. "About whether this is a situation." Vivian dried a cup, set it down. What do you think? I think it's nobody's business but yours. She paused. And I think if it is a situation, you could do considerably worse. Margaret. I'm not meddling. I'm observing. There's a difference. From where I'm standing, there isn't much of one. Margaret made a sound that was almost a laugh. She stood up, straightening her coat. He hasn't been the same since you came. Not since the storm, but before that too. He's been different. The children are different. This house is different. She looked at Vivian steadily. I don't say that to put anything on you. I say it because I watched what it looked like before, and I think you should know what it looks like now. After she left, Vivian stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then she went and found the dead garden. She had been looking at it for weeks. The rows of failed and frost-killed things, the weeds still brown and collapsed from the cold, and thinking about what it had been and what it could be in the spring. She had not let herself plan too far ahead, had been careful not to invest in a future she hadn't been certain would materialize. She stood at the edge of it in her coat and looked at the dormant rows, and she let herself think about spring. It was the first time she had done that. She was still standing there when Silas found her. He came up beside her without speaking and stood where she was standing and looked at what she was looking at. The dead garden in the December light, the hard ground, the bare rows. Helen planted this the year we came here, he said. First thing she did. Vivian waited. She said you could judge a household by its garden, whether people put things in the ground that they intended to come back and harvest. He paused. Said people who couldn't commit to a garden couldn't commit to much. Smart woman. Stubborn one. His voice was different when he talked about her. Not broken, not performing grief, just textured, layered. She would have argued with you. About what? Everything. She argued with everyone. It was one of her best qualities. He was quiet for a moment. I let this go. After. I didn't want to look at it. I know. I've been letting a lot of things go. He said it the way he said hard things, flatly, without softening, as though the honesty of it was the only way to say it at all. The children, the house, myself. He paused. I told myself I was keeping the ranch running, and that was enough, and everything else would... He stopped. Would what? I don't know. Sort itself. Come back on its own. He shook his head. I knew better. I just didn't have anything left to know it with. She stood beside him in the cold and did not offer him reassurance, because that wasn't what he was looking for. He was stating things, not asking to be comforted. I'm going to plant it in the spring, she said. If that's all right with you. He looked at her. The garden, she said. I'd like to plant it. I have some ideas about the layout. Better drainage than it had before, and some different placements. But it's your land and your garden. He was quiet for a moment. What would you change? The rows run against the slope. They should run with it. And there's a corner on the east side that would get more light if we pulled out the dead brush on the fence line there. He considered this. You know gardening. I know what I've had to know. There's a lot of that with you. Necessity is a good teacher. He nodded slowly, looking at the ground. Then he reached into his coat pocket and he brought something out and held it in his palm. And when Vivian looked at it, she went very still. It was a small carving. A bird, no longer than 3 inches, made from a piece of pale wood that had been worked with considerable care. The wings were folded, the head slightly inclined, the whole thing held in the pose of a bird at rest. It was not a perfect carving. The left wing was slightly heavier than the right, and there was a roughness along the tail where the knife had caught against the grain. But it was unmistakably, specifically a bird, made by someone who had spent time with the idea of it. I've been whittling, he said. Can't do much else with one arm. He said it without self-consciousness, but his jaw was set in the way it got when he was prepared for a response he wasn't sure he wanted to receive. She looked at the bird in his palm, then she looked at him. This is for the children, she said. No. He held it out. It's for you. The cold was significant, and the garden was dead, and behind them the house had the sounds of late afternoon in it. Ruth's voice, something banging in the kitchen that was probably Thomas, and from somewhere upstairs the particular creak that meant Wyatt was crossing his floor. She took the bird from his hand. It was warm from his pocket, and lighter than she'd expected, and she turned it once in her fingers and looked at the place where the wing was heavier than it should have been and at the roughness along the tail. It's not finished, he said. It's enough, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, not with the guarded, managed expression she had spent months learning to read around, but with something open and careful and honest. The expression of a man who has decided that the distance he built to survive something has started to cost more than it protected him from, and that the decision about whether to keep paying that cost has been made whether he made it consciously or not. Vivian, he said. Silas. She held the bird in both hands. I know. I haven't said it yet. I know what you're going to say. Last time you said that, you told me not yet. She was quiet for a moment. The cold moved through the dead garden and the light was going the way December light goes, early and fast and without ceremony. I'm not saying that now, she said. He exhaled. It was a small sound. Not dramatic, just the sound of a man releasing something he had been holding for a long time. I don't know how to do this well, he said. I did it once and I wasn't... He stopped. I made mistakes. I was better at the ranch than I was at being... Another stop. Present, she offered. Yes. He said it without defensiveness. I wasn't present enough. And then she was gone, and I couldn't... All I could think was that I'd wasted the time I had, and I couldn't get it back, and I didn't deserve to... He broke off. His jaw worked. I'm telling you this because you should know who you're dealing with. I am not a man who has managed this well. I know who I'm dealing with, she said. I've been here 4 months. And? She looked at the carving in her hands, at the imperfect wing and the rough tail and the time that had gone into the making of it, right-handed, one-armed, in the evenings when he had nothing else to do and the children were in bed. And I think you've been managing it better than you know, she said, just recently. He looked at her, and she looked back, and the cold sat around them both in the dead garden of a house that had been breathing again for months now, and the question that had been suspended between them since the night of the storm, or maybe since the first week, maybe since she'd stood in his kitchen and told him he should have been honest in the advertisement, settled. Not cleanly, not without complication, but settled, the way things settle when they are finished being avoided. The children, she said. They'd want this, he said. Not quickly, not reassuringly, just honestly. I know my children. Clara will take time. Clara takes time with everything. She got that from her mother. Something moved in his face. She'll come around. She's already coming around and she doesn't know it yet. Wyatt went out in the dark last November and watched you go out into that storm and come back with his father. His voice was steady. Whatever Wyatt was before that night, he's not that now. She thought about Ellie's small hand holding the edge of her apron, about Ruth and the green ribbon, about Thomas and the carrots on the fence post. I need it to be real, she said. Not circumstance, not loneliness, not gratitude, real. It's real, he said. How do you know? Because I've been trying to talk myself out of it for 4 months and I haven't managed it yet. He said it so plainly that it landed not as a declaration but as a fact, the kind of fact you can stand on. That's never happened to me before. She stood in the dead garden with the carved bird in her hands, and she understood that this moment was not the arrival of something new, so much as the acknowledgement of something that had been building since the day she walked up that road with $4 in her pocket and a trunk that was too heavy and a set jaw that said she was not going to ask for help and then needed it anyway. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right. We do this carefully. The children are the first consideration in all of it. Agreed. And you tell me things. You don't go silent when things are hard and expect me to manage around the silence. I won't do that. I'll try. He paused. I'm better at it than I was. I know. I've been watching. He almost smiled, just almost. In the failing December light, in the dead garden, it was enough. She put the bird in her coat pocket, next to her own chest, where it would stay warm. They went inside together, and neither of them said anything about it to the children that evening, because some things need to live in private for a while before they're ready to exist in the world. But at supper, when Silas sat down at the table, not in the chair to the right, but slowly, for the first time since Vivian had arrived, in the chair at the head of it, Ruth looked at him, and then at Vivian, and then back at him with the expression of a 6-year-old who has just added something up correctly. She opened her mouth. Not tonight, Ruth, Vivian said. Ruth closed her mouth. She looked at Vivian with enormous, luminous suspicion. Thomas, across the table, met Vivian's eyes for a moment with the quiet steadiness that was just his way, and then he picked up his fork. Clara looked at the empty chair that was no longer empty, and then at her plate, and something in her face did the thing that Vivian had been watching for since December. A movement, small and private, that was not acceptance yet, but was the thing that comes just before it. Wyatt ate 3 portions and said nothing. But after supper, when Vivian was at the sink and the others had dispersed, he stopped in the kitchen doorway on his way upstairs and said, without turning around, "Good," and then kept walking. Just the one word. It was, from Wyatt Granger, a great deal. January came in hard and honest, the way January does in that part of Texas. Not with the dramatic violence of the November storm, but with a steady, grinding cold that got into the walls of the house and stayed there. And the work of keeping 5 children warm and fed in that kind of cold was the kind of work that doesn't stop for anything, including the new and still fragile understanding that had settled between Vivian and Silas in the dead garden on a December afternoon. They had not told the children directly. They hadn't needed to. Children who have been paying close attention. And these children had been paying extremely close attention because children who have lost something learn to watch for the signs of things changing, already new. Ruth had been conducting what could only be described as a surveillance operation since the night Silas sat at the head of the table again, cataloging every interaction between the 2 adults with the methodical intensity of a 6-year-old who has identified a situation and intends to have opinions about it. The situation, as far as the household was concerned, expressed itself in small ways. Silas lingered at the kitchen table in the mornings instead of taking his coffee and disappearing. He asked Vivian's opinion on ranch decisions, and then, not always but increasingly, acted on it. He fixed the cracked basin in her room in late January without being asked again, and he did it on a Sunday when he didn't have to, which was its own kind of statement. She did not make it easy on him. She was clear about that with herself. Not because she wanted to punish him for the lie of the advertisement, which had receded by now into the category of things that had been wrong and had also led her here, and she couldn't hold both of those things with equal weight, but because easy things had a way of not being built on anything. She pushed back when she disagreed. She held her conditions. She maintained her own room and her own clarity about what she was and what she wasn't in this household until those things were properly settled. And they would be settled. She knew that now. She just knew it needed time to be what it was going to be before anyone named it officially. Clara was the variable she watched most carefully. Ota. The thing with Clara happened on a Thursday in late January, and it happened the way most real things happen. Not with warning, not at a convenient moment, but in the middle of something ordinary. Vivian was showing her how to make proper pastry, not the acceptable functional pastry Clara had been producing, but the kind that required cold butter and patience and hands that knew when to stop working the dough. They were at the kitchen table and Clara was doing the thing that beginner pastry makers always do, which is working the dough too long because stopping feels wrong, and Vivian had said stop twice already and been ignored. "Clara, stop. It's not. It's ready. Trust what your hands are telling you." Clara stopped. She looked at the dough with the expression of someone who doesn't quite believe it. "How do you know?" she said. "Because I've done it wrong enough times that I learned what right feels like." Vivian covered the dough with a cloth. "You learn more from the wrong times than the right ones." Clara was quiet for a moment, dusting flour off her hands. Then she said, "Are you going to marry him?" Vivian had been expecting the question for weeks. Not this moment, but the question. She'd been deciding how to answer it for almost as long. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's a real answer, not an evasion. Things are still finding their shape." Clara nodded slowly. She was looking at the cloth over the dough, not at Vivian. "I've been thinking about it," Clara said, "about what it would mean." She paused. "I was angry at first, not at you specifically, just angry." "That's fair." It felt like it meant something about her, like if he... She stopped, started again. Like if he was happy again, it meant he hadn't loved her enough. Vivian sat down across from her. This was not a moment to keep busy with tasks. "Do you still think that?" she said. Clara was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the fire in the stove settled and the kitchen had nothing in it but the sound of cold working against the window glass. "No," she said finally. I've been watching him. He's he's different, but he's more like how I remember him from before she got sick. Her jaw tightened for a moment. That used to make me angry too, that you could do that when she couldn't. And now? Clara looked at her. 12 years old, and behind her eyes something that had been through more than 12 years of ordinary living. I think she would have wanted him to be like that again, she said. I don't think she would have wanted him the way he was, after. She picked up the cloth, looked at the dough, put it back. She was practical. I think she would have been. She stopped. It's all right, Vivian said. I was going to say I think she would have been glad. Clara said it with the careful precision of someone handling something fragile. That he found someone practical, who doesn't fuss. Vivian recognized her own words from months ago, filtered through Clara's memory. That's a very hard thing to say, Vivian said, and a very generous one. I'm not being generous, Clara said, exactly as she had said it that afternoon in the preserve room. I'm being honest. After a moment, Vivian reached across the table and put her hand over Clara's flower-covered one. Clara looked down at their hands. Then she turned hers over and held on, briefly. Not long, not dramatically, and then let go and reached for the cloth to check on the dough again, because that was who Clara was. A person who felt things fully and completely and then went back to work. It was enough, more than enough. Silas asked her in February, not with elaborate preparation or theater. He asked her the way he did most things, directly, with the plain honesty that she had come to understand was not coldness, but its opposite, because a man who softens things is a man who doesn't trust you with the weight of them. He found her in the garden. She had started clearing it in late January. Not planting, not yet, the ground was too hard for that, but clearing, pulling the dead stalks, turning the frozen edges of the soil where she could, getting the fence-line brush cut back on the east side where the shadow had been stealing light. It was cold work, and it didn't need to be done yet, technically, but she had needed something to plan with her hands while things in the house were still finding their shape, and the garden had given her that. He came out in his coat and stood watching her for a moment. It's 28 degrees, he said. I know what it is. Your hands are going to freeze. I have gloves. He looked at the gloves. They were not adequate for 28 degrees. He went inside and came back with a pair of his work gloves, which were too large for her by a significant margin, and he held them out. She looked at them. Then she took off the inadequate ones and put on his, and her hands disappeared inside them, and the warmth of the leather from being inside was something she didn't comment on. He crouched down beside the row she was working and was quiet for a moment, looking at what she'd done. I want to ask you something, he said. All right. I've been thinking about how to say it properly, and I've decided that I don't have it properly, so I'm just going to say it. That's usually the right call. He looked at her. Marry me. She had known it was coming. She had been certain since December. And still, when he said it, that plainly, that directly, with no decoration and no hedging, something in her chest did a thing she hadn't entirely predicted. That wasn't a question, she said. No. He paused. Will you marry me? Better. Vivian. She sat back on her heels and looked at him across the dead row she'd been clearing. His arm was healed, had been for weeks, the splint long gone, and he was crouched in the cold garden of his late wife's planting with the expression of a man who had made himself completely available to whatever the answer was. She thought about Ohio and the road she'd walked up, and the 8 words of an advertisement that had left out everything important. She thought about Ellie's handkerchief and Wyatt's wall, and Clara's flower-covered hand holding hers for a moment before letting go. She thought about the carved bird that was still in the pocket of her winter coat, had been there every day since December, had worn a smooth spot in the lining from being there. Yes, she said. He exhaled, the same small sound as December, the sound of something released. Then he reached over and straightened one of the stakes she'd put in to mark the row's edge, which had been listing slightly, and she understood that this was how he expressed things that were too large for words, by doing the practical adjacent thing, by tending what was near. She let him. Spring, she said. After the planting. After the planting, he agreed. The children first. We tell them properly, together, at the table. Tonight? Tonight. He nodded. He stood and offered her a hand up from her crouch, and she took it, and when she was standing, he didn't immediately let go, and neither did she. and they stood in the cleared edge of the dead garden in February cold, with his work gloves swallowing her hands. And it was awkward and cold and not romantic in any conventional sense, and it was also exactly what it was, which was two imperfect people who had arrived at each other by a road neither of them had planned to walk. They told the children at supper. Silas did most of the telling, which was right. It was his family and his house and his history, and he spoke with a plainness and a care that Vivian had not heard from him in company before, as though whatever had been unlocked in December had given him access to a register he'd nearly forgotten. He said that Vivian had agreed to marry him. He said that this did not replace their mother and was not meant to. He said that Vivian would continue to be who she had been in this house, not a substitute for Helen, not a pretender to Helen's place, but someone new, someone who had chosen this family with her eyes open, who had stayed when she didn't have to stay, who had come out in a storm when she could have stayed inside. Ruth, who had been holding herself in a state of almost painful restraint for approximately 45 seconds, burst entirely. "I knew it," she said, at a volume unsuited to indoor spaces. "I knew it since November. I knew it when he sat in the chair. I told Thomas." "You told everyone," Thomas said, without looking up from his plate. "Because I was right." Ellie, at her place beside Vivian, looked up at Vivian with those serious, watchful eyes. Then she climbed down from her chair, walked around the table, and climbed into Vivian's lap, which she had never done before, had approached and leaned and held aprons, but never this, never the full and deliberate claim of it. She sat there with her folded handkerchief in one hand and Vivian's arm around her and said, to no one in particular, in her small declarative voice, "Good." Ruth burst into tears and then immediately insisted she was not crying. Thomas nodded at his plate. Wyatt, across the table, looked at his father for a long moment. Something passed between them, some adjustment, some renegotiation of a relationship that had been renegotiating itself since November. And Silas held his eldest son's gaze and waited. "She's good for this place," Wyatt said finally. "She's good for you." He paused. "Both of those things are true. And I'm saying them so we're clear." "We're clear," Silas said. Wyatt picked up his fork. "All right then." Clara had not said anything. She was sitting straight at her table, her hands in her lap, her face doing something complicated and private. Vivian watched her without looking like she was watching, the way she'd learned to watch Clara. After a moment, Clara looked directly at Vivian. "Are you going to keep the garden?" she said. Vivian understood the question. It wasn't about the garden. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to keep everything worth keeping." Clara held her gaze for another moment. Then she nodded, and something in her face arrived somewhere it had been working toward for months, and she picked up her fork and said, "I want to help plant it in the spring." And that was Clara's yes, specific and conditional and hers. It was the best kind. The wedding was in April, 3 weeks after the first planting. Vivian had not wanted anything large. Silas had not argued about it, which she appreciated. What neither of them had accounted for was Margaret Holt, who had opinions about what a wedding on Iron Creek required, and who expressed those opinions with the serene confidence of a woman who knows she is going to get her way and is simply giving you the courtesy of the conversation beforehand. The result was not small. It was not what Mrs. Finch from the feed store would have called a proper affair either. No reception hall, no formal dress, no performance of the occasion. What it was the front yard of Iron Creek Ranch on a clear April morning, with the earth turned fresh in the garden behind the house, and the new fence post standing straight along the north pasture, and the sound of the community of Harlan County gathered. Not because they'd been formally summoned, but because word travels in places where people are paying attention to each other. Margaret had organized the food. 3 other ranch women who Vivian had met over the winter had contributed. Tables had been set up in the yard by men who'd arrived without being asked, the way communities do things when they've decided something matters. Vivian wore a dress she had made herself, pale blue, without ornamentation except for a small piece of embroidery at the cuff. Her own work, not fine like Helen's handkerchief, but hers. She stood at the edge of the yard before the ceremony began and looked at what had assembled and felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Not pride, not quite. Something more complicated, a sense of density to the moment, like it was carrying more than just itself. Ruth appeared at her side. Green ribbon. Of course. "You look nice," Ruth said, with the judicial air of someone whose compliments are graded. Thank you, Ruth. You should braid your hair differently. I appreciate the input. I'm just saying it. Ruth. Ruth looked up. Today I'm wearing my hair like this, Vivian said. Ruth considered this. Okay, she said, and reached up and took Vivian's hand. They stood there together while the yard filled, and Vivian looked across it and found Silas standing with Wyatt near the gate, talking about something practical. She could tell by the angle of both their bodies, some ranch business that couldn't apparently wait even for a wedding morning. And he looked up and found her across the yard and stopped talking mid whatever he was saying. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the dead garden and in the barn, and in 100 ordinary moments that had accumulated quietly into the specific shape of what they were to each other. Without the managed surface, without the distance. She looked back the same way. Wyatt followed his father's eye line and found Vivian and said something she couldn't hear. Silas responded without breaking the look. Wyatt rolled his eyes in the affectionate, specific way of a teenager watching his father be human, and then he smiled, actually smiled, a full and unguarded one that Vivian had never seen from him before, and walked off toward Thomas. The ceremony was short. The words were honest. When Silas said what he said it quietly enough that it was nearly private, which was right. There were things that belonged to the two of them and didn't need to be a performance. What she remembered afterward was not the ceremony itself, but the moment just after, when she turned to find all 5 children in a line. Not arranged, not staged, just the way they'd naturally arrived. Ruth in front, Thomas and Wyatt behind, Clara with Ellie's hand. And their faces were all doing different things, and all of those things were true. Ellie was holding her handkerchief. She'd been holding it since the beginning, and as Vivian crouched down to be at her level, Ellie looked at it in her hand for a moment, and then she held it out. Vivian went still. "For you," Ellie said. "Ellie," Vivian's voice was careful. "That's yours." "I know." She held it higher, insistent in the way of 4-year-olds who have made decisions. "But it's for you now." Vivian looked at the small white square with the embroidered flower in the corner. The careful, precise stitches of a woman she had never met, and whose absence she had been living inside for 6 months. She understood what was being given. Not just the object, something much larger than the object, offered by the smallest person in the family, who in the way of small children had understood something that the rest of them had been working toward for months. She took it. She held it in both hands. "Thank you," she said. Ellie nodded, satisfied. Then she reached up with both arms, and Vivian lifted her and stood with her on her hip, and Ellie put her head on Vivian's shoulder with the completeness of a child who is exactly where they intend to be. The years at Iron Creek did not unfold the way. Years do in stories that have decided everything should work out. They were years, actual years, with droughts and illnesses and money that ran short in certain seasons, and the death of the bay mare that Thomas had spent 2 years feeding carrots to, which affected Thomas so deeply and so quietly that it took a winter before the full weight of it was through him. Wyatt left at 17 to work a neighboring ranch, which had been the plan and was the right thing. But the house was different without him in ways that Vivian had not fully predicted and did not pretend weren't real. He came back for holidays and wrote letters in a handwriting that looked startlingly like his father's. And every time he came home, he was further along in the process of becoming who he was going to be. Clara went to school in Halden 3 years running and came home each summer more certain of herself. And at 15, she announced she intended to be a teacher, which surprised no one who had paid attention. And at 17, she was apprenticed to the schoolmistress in town, and she cried when she left, which also surprised no one who had paid attention. Thomas stayed on at Iron Creek and turned out to be the best stockman in the county by any reasonable measure, a judgment confirmed by the surrounding ranches who attempted periodically to hire him away. And he declined each time with the quiet, complete certainty that was just his nature. Ruth, at 12, remained Ruth, louder than necessary, opinionated, equipped with more energy than any situation around her required, deeply and fiercely loving in the way she expressed by telling you exactly what she thought about every choice you made. She braided her own hair now, always with green ribbon, and she braided Ellie's, and she would appear in the kitchen and reorganize things without asking, and then defend the reorganization at length. Ellie grew. They always do. She grew into a serious, watchful girl who spoke less than most but meant everything she said, and she kept the carved bird, the one Silas had made with one arm in the winter of the broken fence, on the shelf beside her bed, and when she was old enough to understand what it meant, and where it had come from, and what it had cost the person who made it, she valued it accordingly. There was an afternoon in the 5th year. Vivian was in the garden, the real garden now, not the dead rose of the first winter, but the living one she had planted and replanted and improved in the ways she'd planned, standing at its edge in December with inadequate gloves. It was summer, high and green and demanding, and she was on her knees in the middle row dealing with something that was encroaching on the beans, and she was not doing it gracefully. She was doing it with the focused irritation of someone in a disagreement with the ground. Silas came out from the barn. He stopped at the garden edge and looked at her working. She didn't acknowledge him because she was in the middle of the thing and the thing required finishing. He waited. He was better at waiting than he used to be. Not perfect. He was not a patient man by nature, and that had not changed, but better. When she sat back on her heels and looked up, he was holding 2 cups of coffee. She pulled off her work gloves and took the cup. "It's 2 in the afternoon," she said. "I know what time it is." "You drink coffee at 2 in the afternoon and then you're up at midnight." "I'm up at midnight anyway." She couldn't argue with that. She drank her coffee. He crouched at the edge of the row, looking at what she'd done and what needed doing, the way he assessed all things, practically, with the eye of someone who understands work. "The northeast corner needs more water," he said. "I know. The drainage is still pulling too hard in that direction. I'm going to reroute it this fall." "You've been saying that for 3 years. And every fall something more urgent comes up. This fall, I'm doing it." He looked at her with the expression she had stopped trying to categorize sometime in the 2nd year because categorizing it required pretending it was simpler than it was. After 5 years, the expression had more layers in it, the weight of actual time and actual difficulty and actual ordinary days, which are the substance that a life is made of when the dramatic moments are done. "You're good at this," he said. "The garden?" "All of it." He said it simply, the way he said things he meant. "I want you to know I know that." She looked at him across the row. He looked back. "You're better at this than you were," she said, "at saying that." "I'm trying." "I know." She finished her coffee, handed him the cup. "The north corner by the fence. I want to put in something perennial there, something that doesn't need replanting every year." "What kind of thing?" "Something that lasts." She put her work gloves back on. "Something the children's children will still find growing here." He was quiet for a moment. "That's thinking a long way ahead." "That's the point of perennials." He stood, both cups in his hands, and looked at the garden for a moment longer. The living rows of it, the things she'd put in the ground and come back to harvest, season after season. "All right," he said, "plant it." She did. There is something that Vivian understood by the end that she had not understood at the beginning. Not fully, not in the way that understanding becomes part of how you see everything. She had walked up that road with $4 and a set jaw, and the belief, not quite conscious, that she was a person who could manage alone, that needing was weakness, that staying somewhere for reasons you couldn't completely defend was foolishness. She had been wrong about all of it, and being wrong about all of it had given her everything she had. The hardest thing was not the storm, and it was not the broken arm, and it was not Wyatt's wall or Clara's grief or the long work of learning how to be in a household that had been hurt in ways that didn't advertise themselves. The hardest thing was the willingness to stay when leaving was still possible, to invest in something that might not work out fully and without the protection of keeping one foot out the door. She had done that. She had done it badly and uncertainly and with plenty of doubt along the way, and it had been real in a way that nothing half-committed ever is. The bird that Silas had carved was still in the pocket of her winter coat. She transferred it each fall when she got the coat out of storage, and each spring when she put it away. It was worn smooth now from years of handling, the rough tail gone soft, the heavier wing no longer obvious. It had been finished by time and contact. It was the best kind of finished. Iron Creek Ranch stood. The fence lines were true. The garden was green. The house had the particular quality of a place where people have built something real, which is not the same as a place where everything has been easy, but is better. On the shelf in Ellie's room, the carved bird sat beside a handkerchief that had been folded and unfolded so many times, the fabric had gone as soft as the paper of a much-carried letter. Both of them kept. Both of them lasting. That was the point of perennials.